All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 8, Section 3, Partisan Politics. So partisan, if you're not familiar, pretty much means like, strong, we'll say political party. Strong political party, I don't know, feeling or ideology or commitment. Commitment. So in this section, we're going to look at the furthering divide between the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans. So even though these two sides disagreed, things were pretty much under wrap because, Washington was such a strong national figure, and Washington could manage Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson at the same time, even though they pretty much disagreed upon everything. However, after 2 terms in office, so a total of 8 years, George Washington decided that he would no longer be the president. And this was important to set a precedent that presidents are not kings and should not rule until they die, even though Washington could have perfectly legally continued to rule, but he wanted to make sure to set an example to say that presidents are more like leading citizens than they are kings. Again, we have to recall that not only was Washington the first president of the United States, he was the first president ever, anywhere. Nobody really knew exactly at which point, sort of where does a president stand between a king on one side and just an ordinary citizen on the other? And the answer is kind of somewhere, maybe hopefully in the middle. But this opened up really the more fierce kind of debate and rhetoric between these two sides, because now this guy that really everybody respected and looked up to, he was gone. And so the partisan politics would now take, further control. The first contested election was in 1796. It pit John Adams from Massachusetts versus Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. Adams represented the Federalist Party. Thomas Jefferson represented the Democratic Republican Party. Federalist support was still pretty strong at this time, and John Adams won the presidency. This had the effect of worsening the relationship between France. Recall that in the French Revolution, it's Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans who favor France, and it's Adams and the Federalists that favor the British. So as Adams gets elected, that doesn't say France. The relationship between France and the United States worsens to the point where the two sides eventually end up engaged in a quasi-war between each other, the United States and France, roughly 1798 to 1800. We call it a quasi-war because it's an undeclared war. Oops. And pretty much it amounts to French ships harassing American ships on the open ocean, typically in the Caribbean in most places. Now, by this point in the French Revolution, the French Revolution went through a number of phases. We talked about some last section, beginning with a constitutional monarchy, but that ended when the French people beheaded the monarch. It led to a more radical phase, the Great Terror. That eventually died down. And, one of the very last phases of the French Revolution was the rise of Napoleon, who essentially takes over the country of France. It's somewhat, I don't know if irony is the right word, but during the course of the French Revolution, it begins with a monarch in Louis XVI, and it ends with essentially, a monarch in some ways, in Napoleon, who eventually makes himself Emperor of France. So we might say of Napoleon, he is a French general. French general turned Emperor of France. And in the later phases of the French Revolutionary Wars. Napoleon rules more or less as a dictator. So now John Adams, who is now the president, fearing the worsening relationship with France, wants to do something about it. So he sends some diplomats over to France in an effort to try to, really diminish some of the ill will, to try and prevent, some more of the shenanigans that are happening on the open waters. And this is presented as the XYZ affair. This becomes a major controversy in the United States. So the XYZ affair is the attempt by Adams to send diplomats to France. However, France wants a bribe. In other words, the French are not willing to talk to the US. The US refuses. And hence, we get the quasi-war. So in short, the XYZ affair is the attempt by John Adams and the United States to send diplomats over to France to try and resolve some of the tension between the two nations. France won't even talk to the US unless the US pays them, and the United States refuses. Hence, we get a undeclared war between the two nations. By this point, any goodwill from the French Revolutionary period is completely gone. This XYZ affair is presented here in this political cartoon. Here is the representative of the United States, and then there are sort of many representations of France and French diplomats, sort of taking advantage, you might say, of the United States in that case. The reason why it was called the XYZ affair was because the French diplomats who demanded a bribe weren't named. They simply just appeared as X, Y, and Z. So that's where the name comes from. So this is important because it's this quasi-war with France, right here. It's this quasi-war with France that gives rise to probably the most important and controversial thing to happen during John Adams' presidency, and that is the Alien and Sedition Acts. So the Alien and Sedition Acts are two laws that are passed by the Adams administration. They are war measures, again, or we might say war measures against France in this case. The first one, the Alien Act, gives John Adams the power to deport any immigrant. The idea was that the French might send in spies, or the French might send in people to the United States to try and undermine the US. So by giving John Adams the power to kick anyone out, that was a war measure. But maybe the most important one was the Sedition Act, and that was, it made certain speech against, we'll say, the Adams administration illegal. In other words, there were certain restrictions to speech. Now, the Democratic Republicans, Thomas Jefferson, and those like were very quick to point out that this was a clear violation of the First Amendment, that it was not constitutional, that you could not make a law that prohibited the banning of speech. One thing that also came with the Sedition Act is that most people who were arrested were actually members of the Democratic Republican Party. So many, like Jefferson and Madison, believed that this was more of a political tool than it was a sort of security measure against the war with France. And so James Madison and Thomas Jefferson led opposition to alien sedition. So we might say led opposition to, we'll just put A and S, alien and sedition, and helped to create both the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which were resolutions to reject the Alien and Sedition Acts And in those resolutions was this idea of nullification, which will come back a little bit later on as an important tool. Nullification is the ability for states, to reject, or as the word suggests, nullify, which means to like cancel out, to reject national laws. In other words, nullification is a strong supporter of states' rights. So in the view of Jefferson and James Madison, again, think, we have this division of powers, this system of what we call federalism. Federalism is the division of power between the national government on the one hand and the state government. So the Alien and Sedition Acts, namely the Sedition Act, was passed by the national government. The states are saying we're simply not going to follow that. It was an especially tense time period in the United States between these two sides, Federalists and Democratic Republicans. There was some belief here that it might lead to some sort of armed conflict. Here's an actual political cartoon of people fighting in some sort of legislature. I don't know if this is actually Congress or a state legislature, but it even led to fights in some of the political bodies there. But Adams sort of backed down a little bit and angered some of his fellow Federalists, namely Alexander Hamilton, who wanted to continue to strengthen the national government. Adams was able to make peace with France, or at least made enough peace with France that the issue sort of dissipated. It was also happening against the backdrop of an election in which Thomas Jefferson won. And so the election of 1800 put Adams versus Jefferson once again. But this time, because the Alien and Sedition Acts were very unpopular, because Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans were more organized this time, Thomas Jefferson turned out to be the winner of that election. And so the Revolution of 1800 refers to not only the election of Thomas Jefferson as president, which is true, but really the first Democratic Republican administration. And this was important because it was a bloodless transition of power from one political party to the next. And again, the United States very, very vulnerable at this time. Administration. Right? You can really think that, ever since the Continental Congress, through the Articles period, through the Constitution, through 8 years of Washington, through 4 years of Adams, pretty much Federalists had ruled that whole time, ever since the inception. So this was the first time that people with the ideology of Jefferson, a weak national government, a stronger supporter of states' rights, would be in power, and what they eventually would enact. Like we said before, Democratic Republicans, we might say more organized. And in some ways, this was the high point of partisan politics, or the disagreement between Democratic Republicans and Federalists. Hamilton personally split with Adams, so we might say that split within Federalists weakened them and allowed Thomas Jefferson and his party to eventually win. Now, for Thomas Jefferson, when he comes into office, it is all about reversing all of the Federalist accomplishments. So changing back pretty much everything that the Federalists did. Thomas Jefferson envisioned, like we mentioned earlier, a rural republic, that of farmers. The idea of a nation of white yeoman independent farmers, that land ownership was really key to the survival of a democracy. Thomas Jefferson was somebody who continued to support, France's effort to, revolutionize the way that governments worked. Actually didn't really like what Napoleon had done, because Napoleon essentially just made himself dictator of France, not really adhering to some of the principles of democracy and republicanism, and to create this empire of liberty. And this was in stark contrast to the way that Hamilton viewed the nation as a nation that needed to copy England, needed to be urban, engaged in trade, engaged in business, engaged in banking, etc., etc. So what did Jefferson do? He ended all internal taxes. This included the tax on whiskey. He also cut the military budget. In Jefferson's view, the nation or the national government should be small national government. And, this was the beginning of a very long period of democratic Republican rule. Sometimes we refer to the period from 1815 till about 28 as the era of good feelings. And that is one party. And by one party, we're talking about the Democratic Republican Party rule. Sometimes also called the Virginia Dynasty. So the Virginia Dynasty is the president. We'll call it the consecutive presidents from Virginia. So it begins with Thomas Jefferson. He's elected in 1800. He rules until 1808, taking Washington's two-term precedent, again, following in the footsteps of what a president ought to do. James Madison from Virginia then serves after that. He's from 1808 to 1814. And then James Monroe, who was nearly elected unanimously, only one vote short. I guess he's from 1814. Did I get those numbers right? No, this should be 1816, actually. 8 plus 8. See, math is difficult. 1816, and then James Monroe from 1816 to 18, what was that for? 24. 1824. So from the year 1800 to 1824, it's all presidents from Virginia. It's all Democratic Republicans, and Thomas Jefferson sort of begins that. However, though, the Federalists would not go down without a fight. Partisan acrimony pretty much means sort of partisan infighting. Maybe reached its high point over the case of William Marbury. William Marbury was a judge. Actually, we'll go ahead and go back. He is a Federalist judge. Federalist judge appointed by John Adams. However, John Adams did not send out the appointment. And so Thomas Jefferson and James Madison prevented William Marbury from becoming a judge. They essentially would not approve or send out his appointment that Adams had created while he was still president. William Marbury sued, and the court case went before Chief Justice John Marshall. Now, there's not very many Chief Justices of the Supreme Court that you should remember in U.S. history. Chief Justice John Marshall is one of them. And what you have to know about John Marshall is that he is a strong Federalist. So in his rulings, he always supports the side of a strong national government. And so this case, Marbury versus Madison in 1803, goes before Chief Justice John Marshall. Again, the case is Marbury sues, in this case, James Madison, who is part of Thomas Jefferson's cabinet, to be a judge. Right? That on the surface is what the course case is about. Now, John Marshall actually denies William Marbury his position, which in the short run makes it look like it's a victory for Thomas Jefferson and crew, but also puts forward a very, very, very important principle, and that is the principle of judicial review. It's a very sort of weird circumstance because judicial review ultimately gives the judicial branch the power to rule on the constitutionality of laws. This is important because this essentially makes, we might just make a note here, makes the judicial branch an equal branch. So arguably, the most important power that the Supreme Court has, which is to rule on the constitutionality of legislation. So let's see, power to rule on the constitutionality of legislation. This was not a power that was initially given to the Supreme Court. This was a power that the Supreme Court gave itself during this court case of Marbury versus Madison. And what we mean by making the judicial branch an equal branch, again, recall our three branches. We have our executive, our legislative, and our judicial. Each of them have certain powers. One of the powers of the legislative branch is to make the laws, right? So they can make a law. Now, with this court case, what the judicial branch is saying is that they're going to take the Constitution, they're going to compare the law to the Constitution, and if the law does not follow the Constitution, aka the rule book, the Supreme Court says we essentially have the power to negate that law regardless of the fact that Congress passed it. So this is a very, very powerful tool that the Supreme Court gets, something that definitely Jefferson and Madison would not have approved of, giving the national government, this sort of power in this way. But again, in the short term, it seemed as if it was a victory. Marbury was denied his position. But this is, again, moving forward in American history, a very important thing the judicial branch does. So that was a very contentious fight. But the most contentious fight between your Democratic Republicans and your Federalists was between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton, we know, as Secretary of State, kind of the leading Federalist. Aaron Burr was the vice president to Jefferson. And the two had a history of slandering each other in the newspaper, particularly in New York, to the point where I believe Aaron Burr challenged Hamilton to a duel in which they would take two pistols, shoot at each other. And in this case, Burr killed Hamilton. So our first Secretary of Treasury was killed by our first, second, third vice president of the United States, really representing kind of the high point of, again, what we might call partisan acrimony or political infighting. We're in a pretty partisan era currently, but until we get to the point where our Secretary of Treasury is dueling our vice president, we're not quite back at the early 1800s yet. But perhaps the most significant and important accomplishment of Thomas Jefferson's presidency was the Louisiana Purchase. So the Louisiana Purchase was territory, or we might just call land, west of the Mississippi River. It was controlled by France. And initially, Thomas Jefferson had sent a couple of people to France to inquire about purchasing the city of New Orleans. This was a port city. You might say port city Jefferson wanted to buy from France. However, because of the Haitian Revolution and France's loss of their most profitable colony in Haiti, and the fact that Napoleon needed money to fight a war in Europe, France and Napoleon essentially offered the United States not just New Orleans, but this entire piece of territory known as the Louisiana Purchase. $15 million was how much it was purchased for. And just like that, with the purchase, the Louisiana Territory doubled the size of the U.S. It was very popular among Americans, even popular among Federalists. So you can see here from this image, more or less up until this point, this is what the United States consisted of, just this side here. And then all of this would be added now to the US. So pretty much doubling the size of the United States. After the purchase was made, Jefferson hired Lewis and Clark to explore the territory. So we might say Lewis and Clark led an expedition to explore the Louisiana Territory. Louisiana Territory. And, their conclusion was that, it was a good purchase and a good investment for the United States.